Hey everyone, uh, can everybody hear me? Yeah, cool. Everyone, I'm Sarjeel Yusuf. Really great to be here, and so I will be speaking about the human aspect of on-call management. So I do not know if everybody can see my slides. Uh, oh, okay. Yeah. So hey everybody. Yeah, as I said, I'll be speaking about the human aspect of on-call and how we really need to rethink, our on-call setup. Right. I am Sarjeel Yusuf. I'm a product manager at Datadog, and I was an ex-Atlassian Ops Genie product manager also. In fact, I started my career in Ops Genie at Atlassian. So I've been in the on-call space, incident response space for quite a while. And I recently made the move to Datadog, and actually this is the first time I'm speaking at a conference, being part of Datadog. So pretty excited to speak to all of you folks, and I'd like to thank everybody at IRConf for setting this up and having me here. Right. So getting into it, basically I want to talk about what does on-call mean, and how has on-call affected the response teams and members who have been responders or have had the on-call duty, right? And this is mainly because on-call is not a new concept, but it is a concept that I feel, and from what I've seen, has seen very little innovation in the way we think about it, right? And this has led, and over the years, we have now understood the negative aspects that on-call has had, right? And I really want to get into the human aspect versus the technical aspect. And unfortunately, we've been very selfish uh, since the advent of on-call, and we've only been thinking about mainly the technical aspects, which makes sense, right? And the way we can really rethink our way of on-call, the way that we can really rewire ourselves, is to first deconstruct the entire idea of alert response and go into the individual components that make that make the alert response pipeline, right? And then by understanding this, only then can we start to reconstruct an on-call practice with a human-first approach, without letting go, without reducing the technical benefits that on-call has provided so far. So getting into it, when we talk about the science of on-call, and as I said, like over the years now, we've actually started getting some analysis around how on-call is affecting responders. In 2015, there was research conducted by a researcher named Carla M. Zieberts and her team, and what they found out in their research, that was titled "The Relationship of On-Call with Fatigue, Work-Home Interference, and Perceived Performance Difficulties," which was then published in Biomed Research International Journal. They found a direct correlation between being on call and fatigue, and they actually realized that the reason why this research was also very monumental was because they've realized that it doesn't really matter of what you do on call, just the fact that you being on call has an adverse effect on the mentality, right? And then this was followed in 2016 by a separate research, quite similar though, by Dan Dittemers and their team and his team, that allowed us to understand that those experiencing on call had increased levels of cortisol, right? And cortisol has been attributed to issues such as hypertension, heart-related issues, and just it's just not a good thing to have, basically, right? So we know that on call is really bad, but there's no solution. There's no way of saying that, oh, let's just get rid of on call, right? Because as we'll never really reach a state where nothing where nothing will ever break, right? And this has really been captured by Werner Vogels, the CTO of Amazon, who famously once said that everything fails all the time, right? So we'll never actually reach a point where everything is stable. The question then becomes, how do we facilitate an environment where the on-call responder feels safe enough, where the on-call responder does not have to be stressed when they're performing their on-call duties? Because as we've seen now, that whenever you're on call, it sucks. You feel stressed. So the question is, how do we make on call less stressful? How do we rethink on call to ensure that it's more human friendly? And this is the talk we'll get into, uh, right? And as I said, like, the main problem comes as we have to try to balance our technical goals, our service related objectives, and also have to think about the human factor of those on call, right? So, for example, when in the last panel, we spoke about, the panelists, the great panelists spoke about how they were measuring the effect of on call, and, like, we heard about things like, how many alerts per responder are we getting, right? So if you're on call, how many alerts are you actually responding to? On some days you may have very minimal alerts, whereas on a different day, you may have a ton of alerts and it's just a rough on call period. How many off hour on call per responder? How many off hour on call, um, times is a responder actually logging, right? And what is the escalation rate? And escalation rate is really an interesting metric, because you're trying to see how successful did the response, or the alert, or the signal of disruption get resolved in the first levels of response, as compared to how much was it, how did we have to escalate it to somebody else, right? And if we see that there's a high escalation rate, that means that the first person that we're actually paging, or the first entity that we're actually paging, is not the right entity. So that means that there's something actually wrong with the on-call, right? And then, of course, as I said, on-call and incident management is not a new concept. So I'm pretty sure we're all familiar with the metrics of MTTR, MTTA, uptime, availability, and all those other metrics. And for a very long time, we have been talking about, on-call systems geared towards optimizing system metrics, right? As compared to actually having an on-call system that also optimizes for the human metrics, right? And so when we try to solve this, we first need to try to understand what on call is, and why are we actually on call, and where are these alerts coming from? Well, actually, they're coming. We all have these monitoring systems, and we all have these monitoring apparatuses set up that are recording events, right? And these events are coming in. They're coming in as signals, as alarms, as alerts, and what signals and alarms, and notifications. And as they come in, some of them, because not every event, some events may be the event of to indicate that the deployment has occurred, whereas some event may indicate that your Lambda function is throttling. The Lambda function throttling event is actually an alert. Now, these alerts that are coming in, how serious are they? And not all alerts are serious. Not all alerts can be considered an incident, or should be considered an incident. For example, if your Lambda function is throttling, it may be throttling right now, but maybe after that may be a single case. It After maybe 2-3 minutes, we see that the Lambda function is operating as normal again. So it's not something that should have woken somebody up at 5 o'clock at night, or at 3 o'clock at night, right? But if that issue persists, then that may be an incident that justifies uh, you know uh, notifying or paging somebody late at night, right? And when we look at it, especially when we look at it from a from a Datadog perspective, and how we're doing it from Datadog, we're ingesting all of these events, right? So and yes, Datadog uses Datadog, so we're ingesting Datadog events, and we're also ingesting third-party events. Now, this is basically to signify that events are being generated from multiple sources. So you can have events being generated from your monitoring tools, which is in many cases the most common area, but you can also have events being generated from your deployment tools, from your testing tools, and whatnot, right? And then you're basically creating these alerts, and you need to understand how you are creating these alerts. You're routing these alerts, and then you're finally paging the responder, and that notification itself gets paged. So you're deciding who to page, and then you finally send out the notification as per whatever notification channels you're utilizing. Now, for a very long time, because on call has been looked at separately, or has been looked at as a single practice, it has not been very effective in trying to reduce the human burden, or the adverse effects that we've seen on responders. Right? We really need to look at on-call practice as a whole, as a whole pipeline, as a whole process, starting from event ingestion, and then we need to start thinking about what can we do from starting from event ingestion to reduce the burden of on-call. Right? So if we like take the most basic system, you especially in this new world of microservices and cloud computing and stuff like that, we presume that we have a bunch of services, right? uh, and I just realized right now that one of my services are mislabeled. So there's three services actually, not just service A and service B. So service A, B, and C. Anyways, so you have a bunch of services, and your service to team associations, first of all, could be many. You could have a one-to-one, such as service A and team one. You could have one-to-many, or you could have many-to-many, right? So service ownership. So first you need to understand who owns the service, and then and when you understand who owns the service, you can theoretically identify who is responsible for that service, or who are responsible for events on the service. That is a very general way of thinking, but in most cases we see it's not that simple. The first thing we need to do is we need to first identify target pages. So as I said, like, if you know who owns the service, then you know who to page, right? But in reality, that's not the case, and we'll see why that's not the case. But another thing, that even before we think about that, we need to first identify, as I said, like, all the events that are coming in. All these events may be related, right? And you don't want to page everybody on every single event. The first thing we should think about is, how do we correlate and group events, so that when we finally do start paging folks, we have some form of holistic view of the disruption, right? We need to stop thinking of events as individual entities, but events as an indicator of something much grander, because your system is living. Just like you go to the doctor, just because you have a fever, doesn't mean that is the doctor will just try to cure for the fever. It may be due to a stomach infection that you may have. And this example is something that is very personal to me, because just in the beginning of this week I was sick with the same thing, unfortunately. Anyways, so what I'm trying to say is, like, you are ingesting a large amount of events, but you really need to start looking at events from a holistic approach, because when you start looking at from events from a holistic view, from a bird's eye view, you start understanding uh, what what may be the problem. And when you finally understand what may be the problem, the responders have more context. So for example, you have an EC2 instance that is experiencing high CPU capacity, and you also have a security signal that is indicating a DDoS attack. These two events could be correlated, right? So you understand, when somebody gets pinged that, oh, the EC2 instance is experiencing high CPU capacity, simply scaling up the EC2 instances may not be the right solution, because at the end of the day, the issue is the DDoS attack, right? And so that's basically what I was getting into. You need to start paging with context, right? And then on top of that, taking the same example of the security signal and the EC2 signal, the EC2 notification, EC2 CPU notification. For example, who are you going to page? This is when it comes to the security signal. You in many teams and many organizations, you really just want to page the security responders, the security team, to ensure that the edge team goes out and blocks those malicious IP addresses. Whereas for the EC2 instances, you may want to ping the infrastructure team. So in the beginning, when I said that, oh yes, you should know how your services are related to your teams, yes, that is a general rule of thumb, but in reality, all the events and all the changes that are happening on a service may not be pertinent to a specific team. They may be you may need several teams to come in to the picture, right? And this is where you need to have the context and need to then use that context that you had through your grouping mechanism fed into your routing rules, so that you know that the event from your security signal goes to the security team, and the event from of the high CPU usage or high CPU capacity of the EC2 instance goes to your infrastructure team. But when both the security team and the infrastructure team look at this alert, the infrastructure team knows that this is because of a security threat, and the security team knows what the impact is of this and how crucial it is to respond to it. And now finally, so basically, like so far we've been speaking about, like, all of these functionalities which are basically allow us to ensure that, both the technical aspects of, like, if you know the right signal getting routed to the right person, you're reducing your MTTR, so the system metrics are being cared for. And we also, because you are providing the right context, also the human metrics are being cared for. But now when we start thinking about the scheduling, the on-call scheduling, it's really important to associate on-call scheduling to teams, because responding to these events is a human factor, right? And when you do the scheduling, include the fairness model into your on-call schedule. So when you're planning your on-call schedules, understand who is on call or who is available throughout the week. For example, maybe somebody on your team is going for holiday, and that means that there's going to be more load on the rest of the team. How do you account for that in future planning? Or, for example, like when you have to take a look at those metrics that we spoke about before, if some folks have been taking more on-call responsibilities or have been taking more on-call load, because maybe everybody has the same duration in the schedule, but somebody has been taking on more load, that should be accounted for. And the scheduling should be done team by team, right? Team members and those on call should feel as if they are responsible for setting up their own schedules, for setting up the schedules that they will be involved in, right? And then finally, we should also think about escalations. And when we think about escalation, that should be related to the services, because it is the services, it is the services that are affected by the changes or by the events that we're that we're ingesting. So, and each escalation should be associated. When you associate each escalation to the service, you basically take into account how critical that service is, right? And how sensitive that service is to downtime, right? So, for example, when an event comes in on a very critical service, you want to immediately ping somebody on call. But if it's not that critical of a service, and if it has high tolerance to false, then maybe you may want to wait to see if that metric can resolve itself in 5 minutes or in 10 minutes. And if it still doesn't, then you can go ahead and ping somebody, right? And finally, try automating everything. Try having auto remediation or action response to some extent in these escalations itself. By, for example, like uh, if a malicious IP comes in, or if a malicious IP has been detected, try blocking an IP should be a standard procedure, right? Or and it may not it, you may not it may not warrant calling somebody at 5 o'clock at night, because we want to create that environment that, yes, our systems themselves will remediate, so we are safe. We the responsibility and the ownership of making sure that everything is fine and dandy is shared by the system itself. All right. And one of the first steps that we can start taking towards ensuring that safe culture, that safe environment, right? And finally, like, also we want to try to create that automation for the uh, in the team. So we want to give teams the ability to kick off uh, automated remediation steps, right? So instead of so if we take the same example of having to block an IP address, imagine you are in a high charge situation where you have to understand what are the malicious IPs. You have to select the malicious IPs. Then you have to go to your WAF, provider. You have to put in those IPs in that IP set or in that IP list, and then ensure that those IPs get blocked. Again, this could have been done automatically. So maybe if you don't want to automatically block an IP in the on as a first response of the escalation itself, then at least allow that to be automated or as an automated step for the responder. So you're reducing the stress of the responder in how much time it takes them to actually perform the remediation task, right? So as I said, like, it's all about creating that safe environment, creating that environment to indicate that yes, things may go wrong, but hey, you know what? You are equipped, you are enabled, you are armed, and also the responsibility is not fully yours as a responder. But for the responsibility that you do own, you are unarmed, and and other aspects. So we talked about, like, how we can go from the most basic service, the most basic event ingestion to on-call environment to how we can have a more robust and more structured environment. But apart from that, we should also think about a concept such as war games. So Julie from Gremlin spoke about war games. We should think about maintaining run books, right? So and these run books are great for onboarding new new folks, and it's also great to refer to during the you know the outage, during the disruption, and during the remediation process. You should ensure escalation paths, right? So not to miss anything. You should ensure automated response and one-click actions. We already spoke about that. We should also ensure that there's postmortems. And like, actually in Datadog, we take postmortems so seriously that we actually automate the creation of a postmortem at the end of every incident. And not only do we automate the creation of the postmortem at the end of every incident, we also we also open up Jira tickets to ensure that the filling of the postmortem is tracked and completed by those by those who were involved in the incident, because we then take these postmortems to create that culture of transparency, to ensure that when something similar happens, we know we're ready, we're battle ready for this, right? Also, it's very important, and we spoke about, especially Pedro and the panel, in the great panel session that we had, spoke about the need for blameless culture, right? And finally, we should also think about actually compensating our our on call, our first line of defense, those folks who stand on the first line of defense. Yes, and when you do all of this, when you actually start taking things from a holistic approach, when you break down on call and you see how each step in that entire event ingestion to notification to paging process can be uh, works together, then we can start taking those necessary steps, some of those steps that I spoke about here, uh, to create that environment of safety that eventually does reduce stress. Right. So I don't know how much time I have left, but but that is the end of my talk. Thank you so much.